Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. So today is June 1st, and actually day 30 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings are ongoing right now, just taking a lunch break after the first panel on critical incident response, and then there's a further panel discussion scheduled for this afternoon, which I'll watch and I'll report on all of that. But what I'm going to talk about now is actually yesterday's proceeding, which was day 29 of the Mass Casualty Commission and involved the taped testimony of Sergeant Andy O'Brien, who was a sergeant in the Colchester detachment of the RCMP. Sergeant O'Brien spoke yesterday to the commission. It was by Zoom and it was taped, and then the video of it was released last night. This is part of the controversial accommodations that were granted to several of the witnesses, several of these supervisors for the RCMP at the request of the National Police Federation and the Federal Attorney General to testify without cross-examination, by video, without what the commission called the pressure of live testimony, the time pressure of live testimony. Which, anyway, just as a standalone explanation, doesn't make a lot of sense. They went through the day yesterday, took regular breaks. They take breaks, they take lunch breaks during live testimony as well. I'm not sure how that was a distinction that the commission identified, but they did, and they said so. So that was their explanation. I watched some of the video last night. It was released or posted to the Mass Casualty Commission website yesterday evening. I watched some of it last night, some of it this morning, and then have been watching the panel discussion as well. Some experts from all over the place, Texas, Finland, Norway, Toronto, and Sydney, Nova Scotia. So I'll report on that later. Sergeant O'Brien actually was called Mr. O'Brien by Anna Mancini, the lawyer for the Mass Casualty Commission who was asking the questions. That was kind of interesting in itself, and presumably that was at Sergeant O'Brien's request to be called Mr. He is retired now from the RCMP, although other retirees have been still referred to by their titles. Staff sergeants typically, one corporal, Corporal Mills. So Sergeant O'Brien was questioned yesterday with these accommodations. My observation would be similar to that of Staff Sergeant Rahill and Staff Sergeant Carroll, which is to say that it did not appear at all as though Sergeant O'Brien required these accommodations. When he was given the opportunity later in the day, it wasn't the case initially, which I'll talk about in a second. When he was given the opportunity to answer questions at length or to speak at length, and then when Commissioner Fitch asked some questions later and he had to speak at length and was challenged a little bit in these answers, he seemed to have no problem answering the questions at length. He obviously had some things prepared that he wanted to say and get across and use in his answers sort of as talking point material, but nothing obvious about his demeanor, about his presentation, about his answers that would have suggested that he needed these accommodations. So again, I think this is harming the credibility, certainly of the National Police Federation. I wonder what the commissioners think after they watch some of this testimony, after they've agreed to these accommodations, and then obviously they weren't needed. At some point, I think they're going to have to put their foot down at any further requests from the National Police Federation. And even I would say if some of the lawyers want to bring these witnesses back for further questions, the commissioners should entertain those requests if they're substantiated with some topics that they want to have covered. So the boycott of the commission proceedings, which is extraordinary. We should remind ourselves that is an extraordinary thing to have happen during an inquiry. That continued yesterday. Most of the family participants were not present. I understand that one of the lawyers from Patterson Law was present a little bit this morning for one of the panels, but that boycott has continued even beyond the witnesses for whom the accommodations were granted. So that'll be interesting to see how that unfolds, which is it's an ongoing situation. So Sergeant O'Brien, I would describe him after watching his testimony as RCMP to the bone. He was certainly there he was prepared to defend the organization. Talked about when he referred to the organization, it was always, we, that's, referred to it in the sort of first person. He had certainly a planned explanation describing the response. He went to this a couple of times. He used an analogy of trying to describe the response to a critical incident such as this, and a major incident, as something akin to starting up a business of 100 people, a 100 employee business, just on the spot. It didn't really, that analogy didn't really seem to make sense to me. A business is not something that is a sort of a one-off situation. It's something that you would start and then presumably hope that would be a continuous entity for as long as the business was successful. So I didn't really understand that analogy. I know what he was trying to say is that you're gathering a bunch of things together at once and you're doing it all on the fly. I think building the airplane while you're flying it is an analogy that's been used. I'm not sure that would be appropriate. He didn't use that, but I've seen that analogy used. But this creating of a business just on the spot, I think the analogy he may have been searching for, although he had lots of time to prepare, so I know he thought about this, or it seemed clear that he thought about this analogy a lot. It would be more like, if you had to have do an event like a wedding or a concert or, a theater production, and, you had the parts, you would maybe practice or done a rehearsal, but, you were just told, all right, on the spot, you need to do this event, do this concert, do this performance now, and we're going to give you the location, and you just send everybody there to do it. A one-off event, everybody has their role, and you go in and you do your thing, and you wouldn't expect it to go perfectly well as you would if you had time to prepare and you knew your location and you had everything set up in advance. Okay. Still, I'm not sure how helpful those kind of analogies might be, other than to say, yes, it was a complicated thing to do. But the presumption behind that is an interesting one. So the presumption that this sergeant is making, and I think some of the other supervisors seem to have this in their heads as well, is that we need to bring in a structure, bring in a large operation to face something like this. And that seemed to be part of the problem, like the idea of a structure as sort of an end in itself. It's sort of a corporatist, bureaucratic mindset that I think we're seeing some of this in the supervisory class of the RCMP, is that, bringing in this big structure with all of these parts is, an important thing in itself. Well, you might suggest that having nimble, agile, flexible, well-qualified officers as first responders that can go in and make their own decisions without having to, worry about the structure, without having to depend on, a command post being set up in a timely manner close by. All of those things with people driving from hours away, having those first responder officers in there being able to and have the capacity and the authority, the autonomy to make those decisions seems like more of the proper approach to these kind of active shooter emergency situations. But, when structure is what and, this hierarchical command is what you're familiar with, maybe that's what you lean on in stressful times. So the questioning from Anna Mancini was very gentle, very leading. She would certainly initially, and then at different times throughout, she'd read entire paragraphs, like long paragraphs from the foundational document, and then basically say, well, what do you think? Do you react? Do you agree with that? And, it would be a short answer and response. At one point, he said, well, there's no playbook for something like this. And then her response was, well, I can certainly appreciate that. Well, not cheerleading isn't the right term necessarily, but it was certainly supportive, the opposite of challenging of those responses. She was like, oh yeah, I guess so. Yes, we can see that. And then, the alcohol situation, we know that Sergeant O'Brien admitted to having 4 or 5 drinks of rum. I would tell you that most judges I know would take that number and, in their minds, double it to presume what the person really had to drink, because nobody ever admits to the actual amount of alcohol they've consumed. So that was an interesting number, a tight range, but certainly would be safe to presume that he had more than 4 or 5. But she gave him a completely open field to talk about that, answer it, and say, all the right things. Well, I wouldn't have, I didn't want to be perceived. I wasn't impaired, but I didn't want to be perceived as, having made decisions on the basis, under the influence of alcohol. Hard to judge. I certainly have no issue with an officer having a few drinks on a Saturday night. They're not on duty. Even an officer in a supervisory position making good decisions based on their training. I'd rather have somebody with a couple of drinks that's making decisions than somebody that just doesn't know what they're doing making decisions. Don't necessarily have a problem with all of that, but I don't think he made good decisions. He made some good comments, maybe helpful to Constable Basselt to say, when he saw the flashlight, which was Mr. Ellison in with his flashlight, to be cautious. And then later to all the members, he went over the radio at midnight to say, listen, if you see this person and the killer, and you confront them and he doesn't comply with your instructions, then be ready to act, be ready to shoot. Okay. Good advice, probably. Was it necessary for him to come over the radio and say those things? Maybe, maybe not. It's not clear. It seems to be like he was at home. He had his wife go in and help him get his radio. He was at his laptop, so he had some technical capabilities to get involved. But he wasn't on the scene. He, didn't have all of the proper information, yet he was the one making some of the decisions. A key decision, and this was one, okay, so a key decision was whether to send the second IARD, the second group of officers that were stationed at the head of Portapique Beach Road, into the community. Basselt, Merchant, and Patton were already in there. Constable Grund wanted to take another second team in and, see what they could find. Well, O'Brien says, no, don't go in there. Well, he waited. There was a break in the radio, and he says he expected other officers, other supervisors to give that instruction, and he said, which was an obvious and clear instruction in his mind, to not send a second IARD, IARD, Immediate Action Response Team, into Portapique. So Miss Mancini asked this question, and it seemed probably at first as though it was a tough question. You said you weren't going to give any supervisory instructions because you were under the, you had alcohol and you didn't want that to be misperceived. And yet very early on, there's this request and you jump on the radio and give the instructions. So isn't that a contradiction? Well, O'Brien had an answer for that. You as you're watching this, you think, well, that seems like a tough question, especially for somebody under accommodations. But I can tell you that was a prepared exchange. There's no question that the questions were known to Sergeant O'Brien. He was prepared with his answer. He knew that question was coming, and his answer, because he knew the exact length of the gap. He said there was a 15-second gap there in the radio. He talked about how he spoke to the other sergeants and the supervisors afterwards, and they didn't hear the request, or they agreed with his decision. So he was ready for that exchange. I thought he had all his explanations ready, prepared remarks, and it all looks good. except it's so easy to do that when you know there's going to be no follow-up, you know there's going to be no cross-examination, you're not going to be challenged on any of your answers. For example, if there had been cross-examination on that question, why not send in the second team? Well, his concern was, a blue-on-blue shooting. Okay, how about you tell everybody to, clear off the radio traffic to allow those two team commanders, Grund and Baselt, to be talking to each other. Where are you? And coordinating themselves that way and making sure that there's no blue-on-blue situation using the simple radio technology. So, why not allow that to happen? Clear out, let them handle things rather than imposing yourself as a supervisor on a situation where you have imperfect information. So we'll see how that goes. I'll be interested to hear the rest of the panel discussions on critical incident command. We haven't gotten into much this morning yet as far as the incident, whether their analysis of the critical response. There's more sort of general training commentary so far. So I'll talk about some of that later on in a video today. But wanted to talk about Andy O'Brien's testimony. Sergeant O'Brien testified yesterday with accommodations, which seemed completely unnecessary given his demeanor and his presentation. He had well-prepared answers to questions which were then not probed further to delve into some of his decision-making process. Decisions that were subject to, the influence of alcohol. One of the things, by the way, I noticed in Sergeant O'Brien's experience was that he was in charge of connecting new recruits to mentors so that they had the proper 6 months of mentoring after their 6 months of training. And I wonder if he was sort of taking on some of the characteristics of a cautious parent. Alcohol can kind of amplify previously held, sort of views or personality characteristics. And if he was sort of, in charge of these young recruits, maybe he's a little protective by nature, and his cautious advice may have been amplified by a few drinks of rum. Who knows? And then also the instinct to take over as a supervisor and assert yourself. Of course, everybody knows that somebody who's drinking is going to be more assertive typically than somebody who's not. So was his instinct to get involved, feel the need to be involved as the sergeant from Colchester, was that the result of his alcohol consumption as well? We don't know, but certainly some lessons will be learned from that one, and we'll see what the commission says about it. So that's all for day 29 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings. I'll be back later this evening with some commentary on the panel discussions that's being held. So until then, thank you for watching, and thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.